You're seated, please state your name and spell your last.
Name is Brett Payne, last spelled P-A-Y-N-E.
All right, thank you, sir. Ms. Taylor.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Will you tell us your occupation?
I am currently employed by the Moscow Police Department as the detective corporal.
What experience do you have prior to Moscow Police Department?
I was served in the military for 6 years. 3 of those were as a commissioned officer in the military police corps.
How long have you been with Moscow Police Department?
6 years.
We're here to talk about the case of the state of Idaho versus BRYAN KOHBERGER. Have you worked on that case?
Yes, ma'am.
What is your role in that case?
I was assigned as the case agent for Moscow PD for that investigation.
Does case agent mean you're the person in charge?
Yes, ma'am.
If I called you the lead detective, would that be a term that means the same thing as person in charge and
Yes,
case
ma'am.
agent?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. What were your general responsibilities as the lead detective in the case?
So when I became case agent, I was assigned to work the command post that was established at the Moscow Police Department, along with my partners in Idaho State Police and the FBI. We managed the command post and directed the general direction of the whole investigation.
Would that mean you would be a person to write warrants and affidavits in support of warrants?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you conduct or direct interviews?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you search for a suspect?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you the go-to person and the person in charge for evidence that would be brought into Moscow Police Department to support your case?
No, ma'am, I was not.
Who's in charge?
That would have been our evidence custodian.
As the lead detective, were you aware of the evidence that would be under the control of the evidence custodian?
Not entirely. I was made aware of basically the most pertinent evidence that was coming in, but I was not aware of every single piece of evidence that was brought into the police.
Okay. During the course of, I guess, the investigation from November 13th forward, was there videos that were collected, like a video canvas done of the community?
Yes, ma'am, there was.
Is that something you were involved in?
No, ma'am, I was not involved in the direct collection of those videos.
Who is responsible for the video collection and knowing what videos exist?
So the way that worked was individual investigators who went out in the community and collected those videos, brought them back to the police department and provided them to our digital forensics office. And then they were later booked in through that channel.
So the digital forensics office would be the responsible entity to receive these pieces of video surveillance, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, I would say it was a dropping off point for those pieces, yes.
And who is that person?
That was a joint effort between Detective Mallory and several people within the FBI.
Which people in the FBI?
I do not remember.
Detective Payne, I'm asking because last week, Detective Mallory told us that he wasn't in charge of these videos. And I need to know where they are. Do you have any idea who the FBI agents are that were also in charge of this?
I think we could certainly find that out for you, yes, ma'am. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, well, I'm gonna need to do that. Let's talk a little bit about what surveillance is out there. These were cameras from different businesses, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, as well as some private residences.
Let's focus on the businesses for just a minute. Those would be collected at main points in Moscow where you might find a person of interest, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. We canvassed pretty much the entire city of Moscow looking for places that were willing to or could provide us video.
And was it also important to think about if somebody were to come into or leave Moscow, the kind of video cameras you might find on those areas?
Certainly, yes, ma'am.
And that would be the east-west road between Moscow and Pullman, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, referring to SR 270/Pullman Road. They wanted that to refer to.
I know that as the Moscow Pullman Highway.
Yep.
I think that's the same thing, or Highway 8.
Works for me.
And that goes from Pullman out towards Troy in that area.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And also important in that video collection would be the north-south Highway 95, the north end of Moscow and the south part of Moscow. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so you collected business videos or had that done, but who I need to talk to about this would be Detective Mallory or an unnamed FBI agent. Do I
Or
understand that?
the agents who were the officers, investigators who collected that specific video would have written reports to the best of my knowledge stating such that they collected video from X, Y, and Z. That would be the best person to speak to about that particular video.
But if they collected it and gave it to Moscow Police Department or the digital evidence people, isn't it your department that I'd be looking at to say, where is this now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about some of those specific ones, but you brought up residential cameras in that canvas as well. Are you talking about things like Ring cameras?
Yes, ma'am. Ring cameras and other sorts of private security systems that people may have had.
Ring cameras have a way of sending out a notice to Ring camera owners to check their data. Is that right?
I believe so.
Was that done in this case?
I do not remember if that was done or not.
Are you familiar with some of the Ring cameras or home surveillance videos in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
In particular, I think your affidavit talked about one on Indian Hills Road. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
How did that camera come to your attention?
I believe Detective Vargas works for MPD. She contacted the residents at that, or the person who lives at that residence, and they provided that camera footage to Detective Vargas.
Do you know why she contacted them?
I believe it was part of just the video canvas, best of my knowledge.
Now, I want to talk about some of the specific businesses, and you mentioned that I'd be looking at a police report to tell me if it existed or not. As the case manager or lead detective, are you familiar with the reports from other officers that may have talked about turning in videos?
Some of them, certainly not all of them.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask that he be handed two defendants' exhibits. They are RR and SS.
No, thank you.
One of the videos I want to talk about comes from the Red Star Coffee Company. Do you know where that business is located?
Yes, ma'am.
Where is it?
That's on Pullman Road and right next to the Stinker Station.
So the Pullman Road that's also known as Moscow Pullman Road, that within the city of Moscow?
Correct.
Okay. And if you look at exhibit RR, and if I can draw your attention to on page 2 to paragraph 9 and page 3, paragraph 9 continues over there. Based on your review of that, am I correct in believing that the Red Star surveillance video was collected and given to Moscow Police Department?
It reads that way, yes, ma'am.
Where is it?
I do not know.
Who do I ask where it is?
That would be through the evidence custodian and MPD. That'd be my best direction for you.
So I need to go to the evidence custodian and ask him to bring all of the videos out so I can watch them all to see if that one exists.
Yes, ma'am.
How many hours of videotape do you think have been collected?
A lot.
Thousands?
Yes, easily.
Detective Payne, I want to look at defendant's exhibit SS now. Don't put our away. I think we might go back there in just a minute. But SS, if I can draw your attention to paragraph 1.
Okay.
would I be correct in believing that I should be able to have a videotape from a place called Monday's Machine?
Yes, ma'am.
Where's Monday's Machine?
I don't know where Monday's Machine is, ma'am. It does not sound familiar to me.
Can you see the address that's also listed in paragraph 1?
Yes, ma'am.
Does that help you know where Monday's Machine might be?
It'd be south of Moscow city limits if memory serves, but that's the best I can recall.
You don't know where this particular numbered address on South Main might be?
No, ma'am.
Well, let's go back to, let me ask you this. Who do I ask where that video is?
Restate what I did before is go through the evidence custodian at Moscow PD.
Let's go back to RR for a minute, and if you can turn with me to page 4. I'll draw your attention to paragraph number 21, particularly subparts B, C, D, and G. Do you see where I'm talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
And there, we're talking about 4 different businesses all within the city of Moscow. Is that right?
That is correct.
And those are on Main Street in Moscow. Is that also right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And if I read the first sentence in that paragraph, am I correct in believing that Moscow Police Department should be in possession of all of those videos?
It reads that way. Yes, ma'am.
Where are they?
I would have to direct you to the video that have been turned into the evidence lab at Moscow PD.
I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to move from videos now, and I want to talk a little bit about affidavits and search warrants that you wrote.
Can I ask a question? You're not asking to admit these exhibits?
You know, Your Honor, I haven't.
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I haven't. The court has those in a pre-filing to put the court and counsel on notice of things we talk about. I'm not going to ask that these be admitted this way. Detective Payne didn't write them, but he's familiar with the contents, so I think I have your questions answered. Thank you. Let's talk about affidavits and search warrants for a minute. Did you author affidavits in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you use affidavits you authored in support of search warrants to obtain information that you wanted to take a look at?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you author the affidavit that was used for the arrest warrant for BRYAN KOHBERGER?
Yes, ma'am.
What did you rely on when you wrote these affidavits?
Be more specific.
Yes, let's focus on the affidavit for the AT&T records. There were 2 search warrants on December 23rd, 2022. Are you with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's talk about those search warrants and the affidavit. First, the affidavit. What did you rely on in the affidavit you wrote for the first AT&T search warrant on December 23rd, 2022?
It was a conglomerate of interviews, data received from cell phones, my observations of some surveillance footage that was taking place, various other things. Go down the line. If you could be more specific on specific parts, I'd be happy to tell you what I'd like.
Okay. There was a part of the affidavit where you talked about WSU officers identifying white belongers.
Yes, ma'am.
And there was a part of the affidavit where you talked about 2011 to 2013 Elantras, and then it expanded to 2016 to include the year of 2016 Elantras.
Yes, ma'am.
What I want to know first is what you relied on to expand that search from 2013 to include 14, 15, and 16.
That information was provided to FBI Special Agent Imel, who's a vehicle identification specialist. He used snapshots from the previously mentioned surveillance videos. And that was his determination on the types of vehicles we should be looking for, rather the year range we should look for. It would be in his report, we'd be more specific, but that was what I based the affidavit off of, that portion of it.
I understand as far as when we get to 2013, but when we go beyond that, what did you rely on to get beyond that?
It would have been his input as an expert in vehicle identification. That's what we
Okay,
relied on.
part of your affidavit talks about WSU officers finding white elantras. And I believe there was an officer that you had some communication with. Do you recall the date you had that communication?
I do not recall the date.
Did you have some messaging system exchange with this officer to talk about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the only means of communication you had with this officer?
No, ma'am. I believe I spoke to him on the telephone as well.
When you spoke to him on the telephone, how did that relate to the date of the messaging?
It would have likely been, if memory serves, it would likely been that same day.
Okay. Does December 20th, 2022 sound familiar to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And so this conversation with this officer from Washington, it related backwards to when he noticed an elantra, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
But when he noticed it, you didn't know about that yet, is that also correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so you don't know about him or talk to him until December 20th, 2022, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
In your affidavits, did you rely on cell phone information and cell phone location information?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you work with cell phone records yourself?
No, ma'am.
Did you see cell phone records yourself?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
When was the first time you saw cell phone records that were attributed to BRYAN KOHBERGER?
I do not remember what date that was.
Well, maybe you can give me an estimate. We know on the 20th, you're talking to WSU about an observation from a month before. And we know on December 23rd, you're asking for AT&T warrants for information. Can you narrow
That's
it
a
down?
yes.
Sorry, Judge.
That's a yes. You can, I just want to get the record. Yes,
Yes, that's
okay,
correct.
thank you.
So between those 2 days, does that help you identify the first time you saw cell phone records related to BRYAN KOHBERGER?
Memory serves, the first time I saw any cell phone records related to BRYAN KOHBERGER was after we received the return from the first search warrant.
Just to be sure I'm tracking with you, when you say the return from the first search warrant, we're talking about the first AT&T warrant.
Yes,
Is
ma'am.
that right?
That's correct.
And in that warrant, you were seeking 48 hours worth of records, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So if I call those the 48-hour records, we'll both be on the same page?
Yep.
All right. You wrote your second AT&T warrant for a much longer period of phone records that same day, December 23rd, correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
How far ahead of that warrant did you see the records?
It would have been upon the receipt of the 48-hour records that came in from AT&T. Immediately after receiving those, I began writing that second section of the second AT&T warrant for the longer period. If that makes sense.
It does. So you get these records and you take a look at them and you start writing your warrant. Is that right?
The records were provided to FBI Special Agent Balance, who began deciphering them. I'm not an expert in cell phone records.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you.
So, no, ma'am, I'm not. So he was the one who was conveying that information to me so I could understand what it was.
So do you get the records and then get them to him somehow?
Yes, ma'am.
The records do they go directly to Balance?
I do not recall what the distribution was on the return itself. I do not recall that.
Are you and Balance exchanging emails about these records?
No, ma'am, not that I remember.
How did you get them to him?
We were co-located. At the time, Detective Balance was at the Moscow Police Department about 30 feet down the hallway.
Are the two of you exchanging text messaging during this time?
I do not remember if you texted during that time.
I may have a record that would refresh your memory. I'm certainly not seeking to have these admitted, but I'd like to hand him some records to see if we can refresh his memory. Do you recognize what's been placed in front of you?
No, ma'am, I do not.
Okay. Does reading the content of some December 23rd messages refresh your recollection about participating in text messages with Nicholas Balance?
It really does not, ma'am.
Will you look at, there's 3 separate stapled documents. Will you move that one and go to the next one?
Still on December 23rd?
Yeah.
I do vaguely remember that exchange, the one at the top of this second.
Is that the one that starts with you identifying yourself?
No, ma'am, it starts with the message says, group text for this weekend, Maria, Nick, Ed, Brett, and Darren.
You look at that third one.
Seems vaguely familiar.
Okay. So just so I'm clear then, Nick Balance is at Moscow Police Department when you're getting, on December 23rd, when you're getting these 2 warrants. Is that right?
If memory serves, that's correct.
Okay. Well, you told me that you're not the guy who understands how to interpret these records. Do you know anything about cell phone towers?
Very little, ma'am.
Okay. So when you wrote this second AT&T warrant, you have possession of Brian KOHBERGER's call detail records or AT&T records, but you don't know what they mean, so you're relying on somebody else.
Yes, ma'am.
Who all did you rely on?
Mainly it was Special Agent Balance. He was my main point of contact for understanding what was going on.
Okay. In fact, in your affidavit for the second AT&T report, there's a couple of maps in there. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And one of them has some video camera information. That's the first map. Where did that come from?
I do not recall. If you have a copy of it, I can refresh my memory and tell you that.
I bet I do. I have what we've marked defendants B.
Are you referring to there's 2 maps, the WSU focused map you're referring to? It's completely washed out on this copy. You can see what it is.
It's hard to see, isn't it? What I want to know is what you relied on to get that first one that talks about WSU and the cameras of WSU. Where'd you get that?
Yes, ma'am. So Special Agent Rob Hilley with the FBI was also co-located with us. He was tasked with analyzing that video from WSU and the surrounding area. So it was a conversation between he and I, pointing out areas of locations where the car was likely seen on surveillance footage. And that's what I relied upon to create that map.
So you created that map how?
Through PowerPoint, I believe, ma'am. Memory serves.
You saved your work on that?
Yes, ma'am.
Let's go to the next map. That one would appear to be a trail or a path from south of Moscow back towards Lewiston or back towards Polk. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Where did you get that now?
Same thing, it was just created using open source satellite imagery and I think it was PowerPoint.
Did you create that?
Yes, ma'am.
Where did you get the information to draw that trail?
So that was used from the cell phone records referred to me by Special Agent Balance on his interpretation of possible places where someone could have driven between the location that it starts there and then back to Coleman.
So you did this on some open source mapping, not anything from Nick Balance creating a visual for you.
No, ma'am. I did view a draft report from Special Agent Balance to help me conceptualize this, but it did not look like this map.
Where's that draft report?
It is, best of my knowledge, it's already been provided to the prosecutor's office through the FBI channels.
Is this the lengthy past draft report or is it a different draft report?
Well, it would have to be the draft cast report. That's the only cast report I'm aware of from Special Agent Balance.
So on December 23rd, are you saying you looked at this past draft report to make that map that went into your affidavit to get the second set of records?
Yes, ma'am.
The one that was given to us in July of last year?
I don't know when you got it.
How many versions of that cast draft report have you seen?
I've only seen that one, ma'am. That's the only one I'm aware of.
All right. And from the FBI, we have Agent Balance and Agent Hilly at Moscow Police Department with you. Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
and all of this work is done with verbal communication, is that right?
The majority of it, yes, ma'am.
And Nick Balance's cast draft report.
Correct.
And I think Special Agent Imel's vehicle identification.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Let's talk about what you were seeking to get in this. Well, let me ask this before I leave the second search warrant. Is there anything else you relied on to obtain that second search warrant to compose your affidavit?
Like I said earlier, we relied on cell phone records from surviving roommates as well as the victims. We relied on interviews with the two surviving roommates that were present at the time. We relied on the surveillance footage, cell phone data. I'd have to go paragraph by paragraph, but that's what jumps to mind.
Of those things, are you relying on other people's work to put that all together?
Yes, ma'am.
Now I'm ready to talk about the things that same day as the first one. And was there anything else from AT&T that you saw or relied on to get the second one off the ground?
No, ma'am.
And in the first AT&T search warrant, are you aware that part of the request was for timing advance reports?
Yes, ma'am.
And in fact, that also appears in your second search warrant request, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And not only do you ask for the timing advance reports from AT&T, you ask for them from several other companies, correct? Verizon's version of it, T-Mobile's version of this kind of timing advance report, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. When was the first time you saw AT&T's timing advance report?
I do not recall when I first saw it.
Where is it?
To the best of my knowledge, all of that information from those returns has been provided to the prosecutor's office.
If I tell you I don't have a timing advance report or any from the other phone companies, where do I look for them?
I would direct you back to the prosecutor's office. Everything that Moscow PD received, in that realm, we have turned over to my knowledge.
But you know you've seen this report, is that right?
I do not recall if I've seen the timing advance reports. I'd have to see what it even looked like to know if I'd seen it.
Do you know what it is?
Not particularly. I'm no expert.
Okay, you wrote the search warrant though, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, how did you get the language for that if you don't know what this is?
So there's no secret that I rely heavily on people who are very highly educated in these topic areas to write this search warrant. So that language was likely conveyed to me through people who know much more than myself about cell phone data.
Who are those people?
Like I said, FBI agent Balance and Detective Mowry were probably my two main points of contact for helping me with that language.
During the course of your investigation and work on the case that became the case that we're here for now, did you communicate with Agent Balance by email?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you communicate with other FBI agents by email?
Yes, ma'am.
And did that relate to the investigation of the scene and later the investigation of BRYAN KOHBERGER?
Certainly, yes, ma'am.
Were those communications that assisted you in preparing affidavits and search warrants to carry out your duties in the case?
I do not recall.
But you recall the emails themselves
I recall sending emails to FBI agents, yes, but
And-
the specifics, no.
and receiving them?
Yes, ma'am.
Where are those emails now?
All emails that Moscow PD is aware of have been turned over to the prosecutor's office.
Your Honor, if I could have just a minute.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions for now, but I think you have a couple of exhibits on the front end. If you don't need them for us, maybe I'll take them back.
Well, hold on. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I'll.
Yes, okay. I thought you were just stepping off, so. Jennings?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Morning.
Good work.
Your knowledge, have all the evidence in Moscow Police Department's possession been turned over to the state for us to discover?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you facilitated the defense visiting MPD to review the physical evidence in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
Approximately how many times have you done that?
I had to guess, I'd say 6.
Now, let's talk specifically about this video surveillance. Explain to me the process for collecting video surveillance.
So in this investigation, the way that played out was we directed the investigators to go into the community and collect any available surveillance footage there was. Once they had done that, they were tasked with bringing it back to Moscow Police Department, placing it in the digital forensics lab, and then writing a supplemental report on where they collected that information. That was the process.
Do you know how many agencies helped in this video canvassing?
Certainly the FBI and the Idaho State Police. I'm not sure if any other agencies helped. I don't know.
Do you know approximately how many agents were out collecting video?
Easily over a dozen. I don't know the specific number, but
Isn't it true that investigators collected video surveillance from approximately 79 businesses
yes, ma'am.
and approximately 10 residences? So let's talk about the areas that Ms. Taylor mentioned. Isn't it true that there's other surveillance video capturing the Moscow Pullman Highway, specifically on the way to Pullman?
Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it true we've turned over video for banks
Yes,
on
ma'am.
that highway? Isn't it true we've turned over surveillance for stores on that highway?
Yes,
Isn't it true we've turned over video for gas stations?
yes,
Now let's talk about the Troy Highway towards Troy. Isn't it true we've turned over surveillance video for fast food restaurants,
yes,
gas stations?
yes,
And now US 95 towards Coeur d'Alene. Is it true we've turned over surveillance video for hardware stores,
Yes,
gas stations?
yes,
Now, what about US 95 towards Lewiston? Is it true we've turned over surveillance video for gas stations,
yes,
as well as apartments?
yes.
Now let's move to your PC affidavit. Can you explain to me what did the investigation look like during the time that you were writing that affidavit?
So as I said, the command center was established at the Moscow Police Department. The command center consisted of myself and numerous partners from the FBI and the Idaho State Police. We were all co-located there at Moscow PD. We also had individual sections assigned to do various tasks, collect video, conduct interviews, so on and so forth. The majority of those people were also co-located at the Moscow Police Department. So as the process for developing this affidavit began, those people would just come into the command center and relay information that was deemed to be critical or important. The reason for that was to shorten the chain of information to make sure that the folks, myself and my partners in the command post, got the clearest view of what the investigators on the ground were actually retrieving and learning as this went on. As they relay that to me, I can put that into the affidavit.
And is that standard to rely on what other investigators tell you when you're applying for warrants?
Absolutely.
And is that what you did?
Yes, ma'am.
And is what you relied upon detailed in your probable cause affidavit?
Yes.
Now, talking about the timing advance records, are you aware that AT&T didn't provide timing advance records in December of 2022?
I do not remember.
Are you aware that they did not start providing those records until May of 2023?
Objection leading.
Cross-examination.
It is overruled. Go ahead.
I'll re-ask. Are you aware that AT&T did not provide those records until May of 2023?
Yes.
I don't have anything further.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor?
Thanks. Let's start there. May of 2023. Do you have timing advance records now from May of 2023?
I would have to direct you to Detective Mallory to answer that question. Don't know.
Okay. Did you write a new warrant for them in May of 2023?
I do not recall.
If you included them in two separate warrants in December of 2022, but they didn't provide them, why would you do that?
It was the language that was suggested to me to write the affidavit, so.
Language suggested by an FBI agent who's an expert in the field?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. And do you know if he saw the timing advance reports?
I do not know.
All right. Now, those first and second AT&T warrants were how many hours from receiving the return on the first one until the second one was given to Judge Marshall at 4:45?
I do not remember.
Not very many hours, though. Would that be fair?
Likely not.
I want to talk a little bit more about the video and what's been turned over and what hasn't been turned over to us. And I want to focus a little bit on South US 95. Do you recall that south of Moscow on US 95 is the path that you put in your search warrant and affidavit alleging that BRYAN KOHBERGER left Moscow going south on US 95?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And are you aware that one of the videos that you gave us, the coffee shop there on South 95, that leaving Moscow, you'd have to pass that covers 5 a.m. to 6 a.m.?
I do not recall the time frame for that.
And so the time frame in these videos would matter, right?
Certainly.
The time frame in the videos to be meaningful would need to cover a time that surrounds the allegations against Mr. KOHBERGER. Is that fair to say?
You could say that, yes.
Okay. And are you aware that Watson Kari Construction had a video, and that also has a very limited time frame, like 5 a.m., just 1 hour of video? also,
Sounds vaguely familiar, yes.
and that's also south on Highway 95, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And the one we talked about today, Monday's machine that nobody can find, that clearly was given to Moscow Police Department, that's also south on 95.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I understand that you had a lot of help on canvassing and collecting things. There was a lot to do. But as the lead agent and the lead department, is there some kind of inventory of these videos, like a general inventory that would help me know what you have and why you don't have the relevant timeframes?
The inventory that would be most useful to you is the inventory of evidence that has been booked into the Moscow Police Department. That's the inventory.
And I did come see the evidence. That's fair. I did come see the evidence. We didn't watch videos together though, did we?
No, ma'am.
And would you agree that that evidence is on thumb drives with stickies on papers that tell us different things, but not like an inventory of what's on each thumb drive?
I am not aware of an inventory of each individual thumb drive.
Okay. So for us to do that together would take some days to inventory it all together. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's my best way to try to find this Monday's machine
Sure.
and Wasson Carty Construction.
Yes, ma'am.
That's it. Thanks.
All right, Ms. Taylor, anything to follow up on that, Ms. Jennings?
Oh, just one second. Thank you. I just want to clarify what's in your probable cause affidavit. Does your probable cause affidavit state that Kohberger or White Elantra went on US 95 south of Moscow?
No, it's not.
Okay, what does it state?
Memory serves states that the next time, well, it states that a vehicle was seen leaving the area of the crime scene, McKean Road, leaving via Walenta Drive, which heads south from that area, and then terminates on Conestoga and Moose River Drive. That's what the probable cause affidavit states.
And to your knowledge, are there other paths of travel south of Moscow besides US 95?
Yes.
And what's that other route?
I believe the one that was referenced in the affidavit goes from Moose River Drive, which turns into Sand Road at the state line, not the Idaho-Washington state line. That road continues westbound until south of Pullman and eventually leads north into Pullman at Bishop Boulevard, if memory serves.
And does that path of travel go by Wasson Carry Construction?
I do not believe it does.
Did you attempt to obtain surveillance on that path of travel that doesn't go through 95?
Yes, we did.
And were you successful?
I don't believe we were.
I don't have anything further.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Taylor.
Are you testifying that Mr. Kohberger did not use Highway 95 south of Moscow on November 13th?
I'm testifying that there are various routes that a person could take south of Moscow to include Highway 95. There are also several others.
Which one does your map depict?
I believe the map starts well south of Moscow, more towards Genesee, and there is the line that starts there. However, I would direct you to the paragraph at the beginning of the map that says this is a possible route to travel between the two locations.
So you're just not sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That would include then Highway 95 south of Moscow.
Yes, ma'am.
And that would include other possible routes.
Yes, ma'am.
How many video surveillance attempts did you make to get video from businesses or homes on all of those routes?
I do not recall, but it continued for some time, attempting to find additional video footage.
What did you find?
Nothing to my recollection.
Not one video depicting the car.
To my memory, no.
Good enough, thanks.
All right, thank you. Okay, great. In this Detective, Payne be excused at this point.
He can be, thank you.
Okay, any objections? All right. Thank you, sir. Thanks for being here. You can, you're free to stay or leave.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Your Honor, we call Sy Ray.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, sir. Thank you.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth and the penalty of perjury?
I do. Right. Thank you, Sue. So you go ahead and have a seat there, and then please state your name and spell your last.
Sy Ray, R-A-Y.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Taylor.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Will you tell us what you do?
I have a handful of different jobs, but primarily for my role here, I do a lot of consulting, analysis, and evaluating geolocation data as it pertains to mobile devices.
Let's talk about how you got to that place where you provide consultation on devices and geolocation.
Okay.
What background led you to this job?
I started with a law enforcement background. I started my law enforcement career in 1995 in Arizona. Started working with the first set of cell phone records in that capacity in 97, late 1997. There wasn't a lot of training. Obviously, cell phone technology and the use of that in criminal investigations was very new and novel at that time. So most of my early training came directly from the carriers. If I was working a case with Verizon or AT&T, I would work directly with Verizon or AT&T engineers to understand the records, what they meant, how to map them, how to interpret it. In 2000, I started a very small police department in Arizona. In 2000, I transferred to a much larger police department in the Phoenix area. When I made that transition, I took more of an investigative role. I was previously a patrol officer. That investigative role, I started with a DEA task force where I worked with drug narcotic interdictions, and the primary role there working with cell phone records. So I had some more training experience in that capacity. In 2001, late 2001, I left that position and I went into a full-time investigations position. I started with sex crimes and child crimes. Again, using cell phone records and attending what training was available. Again, most of that is from the carriers directly. About 2004, I moved out of sex crimes and child crimes into persons crimes or violent crimes. So any type of a dangerous or violent crime against a person. Continuing to work with cell phone records and attending what training I could. In 2008, I was promoted to sergeant and I was immediately put into a homicide robbery sergeant's position where I stayed until 2010. Around 2004, I started doing a lot of work with cell site simulators, and that is a piece of equipment that allows you to physically go out in the field and find a mobile device. In a very brief summary, it's the ability to create a fake cell tower that is mobile, it's in a vehicle. And if I can analyze your phone records and determine a rough area that you're at, I can put this mobile platform in that area. Your phone will register to it and I can physically track the phones. It's in courtroom, it's in a bedroom, wherever it may be. In 2007, our agency purchased that equipment. So prior to that, I was working with other agencies looking for devices using it. 2007, we purchased our own equipment. That purchase also prompted more training. There was a company, it's owned by Boeing. They came in and I had 80 hours at that point specific to cellular network engineering, how to go out and actually conduct these surveys to understand how a particular cell phone network works in a particular area, how to replicate, how to create a cell site that looks legitimate in that area. I worked with that company for a number of years in doing that, hundreds of hours worth of back and forth working, actually going out in the field and doing this. In 2010, I had an opportunity to go to Afghanistan as an advisor. charge of an undercover Afghan police team that targeted IED cells. And again, we would look at different types of technology that we could leverage in doing that. I came back in 2000, late 2010, early 2011, and went back to the police department. In 2012, our department created a position that this was a full-time position. Now that's all I did was track phones pretty much every day, using cell site simulators, using phone records, whatever technology we could leverage. Because of the lack of training that was available when I was a younger officer, in 2007, I started a training company. At the time it was called Phoenix Training. And I created a training company to provide law enforcement training, specifically as it relates to cell phone records. I've been providing that training from 2007 up to, we're about 2013 now. I was really frustrated with the lack of software and training available to law enforcement. It's very complex and clunky, for lack of a better term. So I began researching and teaching myself how to do some basic computer programming. And I wrote a program that I could take phone records from any carrier in the United States, and I could put it in this program, and it would immediately map hundreds, if not thousands of connections. It was pretty unique at the time. There just wasn't a lot of options out there that was doing the geolocation. There was a lot of analytics to who's calling who and how often they call that person. But specifically to put it on a map for detailed geolocation data, there was a big gap in the market. It worked. It worked really, really well. And at the time, because we were tracking phones in the field, it gave me this very unique opportunity where I could use a search warrant, get phone records, analyze the phone records, come up with a hypothesis that this phone is most likely Thursday at 2 a.m. going to be in this neighborhood, and then physically go to that location to recover the phone. And then I could evaluate, was I right? Was I wrong? Do I need to tweak something? Mid-2013, our agency was assisting a lot of other agencies because we had, for lack of a better term, we had progressed significantly on our ability to find the phones. I had a lot of agencies asking me for a copy of my mapping program, and I was just about at 20 years at that point. I realized maybe it's time to go do something else. So in May of 2014, I retired from the police department and I started a company called ZETX, Z-E-T-X. And we offered a couple different things. So we had the mapping program that I just described. Obviously, when I'm running it on my laptop, it can be a little clunky. It doesn't have to be perfect. When we started business, we actually hired computer engineers to come in and take what I had written and scale it to a national platform. So we offered the mapping services, which was both real-time and historical. We took that original training class that I had built and we scaled it out. So we had a basic 40-hour, that would just give you the nuts and bolts of how to look at phone records, what they need, what type of records to obtain. We also started a subject matter expert course. It was one of the first courses in the country where law enforcement could actually come in and become certified as subject matter experts in this field. Did some training courses as well that we created on drive testing, so the ability to go out and scan and monitor cellular networks. Because of those two features, my job duties changed dramatically, where I found myself consulting with law enforcement daily, sometimes multiple times in a day, on cases very similar to this case, where I would have a law enforcement agency that's using our product or has attended our training that would call me for some type of review or analysis. And I've lost count. It's thousands and thousands of cases. To put that in perspective for some just general numbers, I sold this company in 2021. At that time, around 2021, 2022, the system had mapped over 2 billion phone calls in the United States. We were seeing thousands of uploads a week. We had created this program in 2014 that if any law enforcement agency in the country called us because they had some type of a crime, we would overnight them a drive test scanner, which gives them the ability to go out and do a forensic examination of cell tower networks. It was no cost. We ate all of the cost of this. So we paid for the scanners. Initially, we paid for the shipping. And the idea there is we wanted to create a national tower database that would have just a collection of drive tests. I want to say we have over 3 million towers in that database today that have been scanned or measured in some capacity. I am unaware of any other database in the world like it. And we use that to feed the mapping platform to increase the accuracy of the mapping. Something that we did that was very unique with our company is we actually provided an estimated coverage area. So instead of just saying this phone connected to this cell site in the antenna points north, we would give the person doing the analysis a general idea of where that phone could possibly be within a radius. We were the only ones doing it when we did this. Since then, since 2014, more recently, since about 2020, pretty much the rest of the industry has adopted, if not the same standard, a very similar standard. So the company we were using to do the drive test data is a company by the name of Rohde, ROHDE, and Schwarz, SCHWARZ. They're a German company out of Munich. They've adopted the way that we were doing some of the ranging. The FBI task team has adopted that, has actually brought that tower density is what is the general term for it. And it's now a feature in the CASBIS program. So through the years with training, I've probably been involved in training 30, maybe 35,000 law enforcement officers from around the country. We had about 650 law enforcement agencies within the United States. At some point, all of the federal agencies have used our products in their training. And I've done quite a bit of consulting internationally as well. Towards the end of that period, we started working more with Rohde and Schwarz. Rohde and Schwarz decided that they wanted to look at the ability to implement a cell site simulator in the United States. They had one for Europe. They were considering doing it for the United States. So they sent me their first one for the United States, and I worked with their engineers for about a year, testing it, reviewing it, improving it. So another several hundred hours there. I've tried to figure out how many of these missions, if you will, of going out and finding a phone or looking at phone records, and it is literally thousands and thousands of hours at this point. I can't tell you specific number. But that would be the background.
Sounds like your background is mostly in law enforcement, and then you moved into a specialty with cell phones, cell towers, drive testing, radio waves, all of that kind of thing.
That would be correct.
Through that and through the training of other officers to do this work and to use your program, have you testified as an expert in this field?
I have. If it's not 100 times, it's right there near it. Roughly 100 times in both state and federal.
And have you been qualified as an expert in state courts,
Yes,
in federal courts?
yes.
How about Idaho?
Don't think I have in Idaho. I've consulted on a lot of cases in Idaho, but I don't think I've ever had testimony in Idaho.
This your first time then?
I believe it is.
Generally, when you work, and I'm talking about when you've done your consulting work or worked with an agency to do what you do to review the records and to analyze the data, do you usually work with the defense?
This is the first time I've ever testified for defense.
Fair to say you usually are a prosecution witness?
That is a very fair statement.
Well, here you are, and you're working with us in Mr. KOHBERGER's case. What's your role in this case?
Trying to conduct an analysis of all of the geolocation data. At this point, still focused primarily on Mr. KOHBERGER's device, ultimately all devices, but any geolocation data, which is the ability to look at a specific area, whatever range or size that might be at a specific time, and put some type of accuracy and reliability to a phone's travel. Maybe it's stagnant when it's moving, when it's not moving, when it's off, it's on, those type of things. But specifically as it relates to network, so the cellular network or a Wi-Fi network, I am not a forensics digital guy. I don't get into cell extractions. I'm not looking at the metadata on the phone. I'm looking at it very much as a network tool.
If I can make a rough distinction, you're not the person that's going to tell me who they called and which Facebook groups they might be a part of. You're not going to look at the data from the phone like photographs. But you're gonna tell me the places this phone went and how it was used while it went somewhere.
Kind of. Let me clean that up a little bit. I will look first at where I believe the phone went, where it traveled, how it got there, how long it took, possible routes. And then to your point, I call it cooperative data. I'm then going to seek out all that data you just talked about to say, okay, well, we have these 3 photographs, we have this piece of surveillance video, we have these 4 receipts. I'm going to overlay it with my analysis so that I can corroborate the analysis accurate, or maybe we see activity associated with that person and the phone's not there. Does that person just not have the phone, or is part of our analysis wrong? Maybe surveillance details wrong. We don't know. So eventually I will get back to that data you're talking about, but I'm not the guy that's going to go out and extract that data.
Would it be fair to say that that's data that you would use in a final analysis as it comes in from other sources, that you're the go-to for me to understand how a phone works with a tower and how it moves between towers if the phone's in motion somewhere?
Yes, 100%.
You talked a little bit about drive test data or drive testing, and that being part of the company that you developed and part of the work that you've done. Is that helpful in understanding the ultimate picture?
Depending on the type of records we're dealing with, it can be very helpful. When we're looking at just basic call detail records, CDRs, a lot of times we're just getting connections to a particular cell site, and we can say a PSY of that cell site. Sometimes the frequencies that are used. Drive testing is really the only way to get a little bit more specific with where that phone may be. But more importantly, we can start to rule out areas we know it's not by drive testing. So just think of drive testing as a forensic evaluation of the actual cellular network in a particular area.
Fair enough. Are you familiar with AT&T records?
I am intimately familiar with AT&T records.
How long do you think you've been working with AT&T records?
28 years.
In our case that we're here on today, have you reviewed any AT&T records that relate to Mr. KOHBERGER?
I have.
What have you reviewed?
What AT&T refers to as their regular CDRs, which is a report AU as an atom unit. I have identified the report CT as in Charles Tom, which is the subscriber information. There's a really weird name called locabor, which is AT&T's attempt to estimate general locations using latitude and longitude. I don't want to say GPS because it is different than GPS. I believe I've looked at some Payne data from December. For the most part, that's what I've reviewed so far.
Have you looked at 2 separate AT&T warrant returns from December 23rd, 2022?
I have.
In your experience with working with AT&T records, is it common or uncommon to have 2 warrants, one that relies on the content of the first and the same day?
It's not uncommon to see a small time period that produces results that would increase the desire, the need for a bigger time period of records. Seeing that entire process happen twice in the same day is extremely rare.
Well, the first AT&T record, we called it today the 48-hour AT&T record of BRYAN's call detail record. If you were to take that and do an analysis on a call detail record, how long would that be?
Depends on the analysis. So I'll qualify that answer with looking at what was put into the second warrant that shows us at least parts of that analysis to include a route that was identified. To do it reliably and feel comfortable that I'm accurate, at least 3 hours. And that's if you know what you're doing and you have all the tools at your disposal. Arguably, you could spend half a day or more doing that very easily.
To do that, do you just take these records, printed copy, and know what's on there, or do you have to do something with those records?
you'd have to use some type of a mapping platform, software. And you would take the digital copy, which is typically a text file, you would import it into that program, which would then map everything. But if I'm going to use those results, search warrant affidavit, for example, there's a process that I'm going to go through to confirm the accuracy. Because in theory, if I'm wrong, the entire linchpin of that case is now hinged on this affidavit that I wrote. So before I commit to swearing out to an affidavit, hey, this is what the phone is doing, X, Y, and Z, there's a further process of just mapping it to validate it. In this case, there's a lot of time distance measurements that need to be performed that can be extremely time consuming. There's some ulterior issues that come up with how that phone is interacting with other cell sites that needs to be analyzed. Again, saying that a very qualified, competent investigator spending half a day just coming up with that basic summary is very reasonable.
In that half a day, you would put that record into a computer program and a map would be produced?
Correct.
What other information besides that call detail record would you need to do this analysis?
In this case, I would want the call detail records. I would want the locabor, it's LOCABR. And I would want the regional cell tower list from AT&T.
Does AT&T generally provide that regional cell tower list inside of its record that it produces pursuant to the search warrant?
No, I would actually say by policy, they do not. It's a very large file. It typically does not transmit very well to government email. So they would direct users of where they could go online and download.
And have you looked at this record, the 48-hour AT&T search warrant record, the return on that?
I have.
Did that include the regional tower list?
It did not.
Okay. So if you are doing this analysis, you put CDR records into a computer program, you put a regional tower list into the computer program, what does it produce?
The CDRs would show me cell sites that the phone connected to. In this case, even within the 48 hours, there's hundreds of those cell sites. So it would take a while to really look at that. The regional cell site list would show me the cell towers that the phone's not interacting with, which can be just as important.
Does it spit out product to you, or does it create something that you can reference to write your next warrant?
Depending on which mapping platform you're using, they all create some type of a map that the person doing the analysis on can interact with, and they can change things, they can save things, they can create work product. Depending on that platform, that's saved in different types of maps, but yes, all of them would have some type of a mapping platform.
Okay. Would that be consistent with this past draft that we heard about earlier?
It's my opinion that Corporal Payne probably is misusing some terms there. I don't see any possibility of the FBI CAS team producing a CAS draft report on the 23rd. I think he's probably mistaken that he saw some type of CAS work product, which would be this map, before they export all those results into a report. So I believe that he probably saw some mapping through a mapping platform. It would really surprise me if there was a physical report. It would be completely out of character.
In that first AT&T report, did you, or request search warrant and affidavit, did you see the request for advanced timing reports?
I did. It's in both search warrants.
Did you get a copy of that in either return?
I have not seen any timing data in this case.
In December of 2022, did AT&T have this advanced timing report?
They absolutely did.
Was it something that they could produce?
It absolutely was.
And in May of 2023, how's it different to that May of 2023?
Prior to May of 2023, only certain agencies were receiving this timing report, the FBI being one of them. What was referenced earlier about the May 23 date, that is when AT&T started offering the same type of reports. It's a little different, but it's the basic timing report. to the state and local law enforcement as well. But prior to that date, state and local law enforcement would have to leverage these reports through federal agencies that had access to them.
Let's talk about the return on the second AT&T warrant. Did that have the tower list, the regional tower list in it?
It did not.
Did it have call detail records?
It did.
What time span?
I believe it's from June 23rd of 2022. The historical was as of the date of December 23rd, but there was also a real-time PIN register that was added that extended, I want to say, to the end of December, maybe very first of January.
What's a real-time PIN register?
So the second search warrant asked for a couple of different things. Historical records going back to June 23rd to the current date, which was December 23rd. The second piece that was asked for is real-time data from the network, which is commonly referred to as a PIN register, or trap and trace. And it's the ability of law enforcement to monitor network connections in real time. So as that phone connects to the network for certain reasons, I can see those connections. It's not a wiretap. I can't hear anything. I can't see content, but I can tell the phone is connected to a particular cell tower. There's also what's referred to as ping data, and that's going to be AT&T's estimation of where the phone is at, and that's provided by latitude and longitude, and that comes in every 15 minutes.
What is the purpose of one of those devices?
I should probably clarify. The third thing was the authorization for a cell site simulator. So it was a combination of all of these. Just as a matter of policy, and I think pretty much every law enforcement agency in the world has adopted this if they can. To use the cell site simulator, you want to see a real-time feed of the phone. Otherwise, you're driving in circles where the phone may not be. So it gives law enforcement the ability to have a general understanding of where a phone is operating or functioning. And then I can use the cell site simulator to do it. There's a number of reasons an agency might do this. This search warrant actually says they were requesting this because they were trying to locate where Mr. KOHBERGER was.
Going to the understanding what's happening right now, is that used so that you don't just know where the phone was 5 minutes ago, but you know where it is right now?
Within a time period, it's not a perfect system. There is a little bit of a delay and the information comes in intermittently. So it's not a real-time feed of giving constant evaluation of where that phone is. But if you know what you're looking at and you've done it long enough, you can get a pretty good idea.
I heard you say that this is to try to find out where Mr. KOHBERGER is. In the information that supported this warrant, didn't they already know where Mr. KOHBERGER was?
I reviewed a lot of documents that clearly state not only did they know where he was, they had a surveillance team with eyes on. So yes, it would be unusual for an agency to request this type of equipment. And I need to qualify that. This truck driving around is about $1 million. It's not something you just park in the garage at night. It's a very expensive resource. It's a very technical resource that requires a lot of training and skill to use properly. So typically when it's used, it is used for, hey, we don't know where this person is at and we need to find them. And to be very honest, I don't have an issue with that part. I've used it 1,000 times. It's a good tool. It's a great tool. However, if I know where a subject is and I'm physically watching him, it's probably disingenuous for me to get a search warrant justifying it that I need to find him.
Makes sense. Thank you. I want to switch gears and talk about the CASBIZ program.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the CASBIZ program?
I am.
Why?
I've worked with a lot of agencies that have used it and accessed it. So I've worked on cases where we've used different mapping platforms to do kind of a compare and contrast as a peer review. So they would create a work product, we would create a work product, and we would check each other's work. Because at the end of the day, we're just looking for the accuracy. We want to see if there's any errors in that. I would say I probably have worked with the CASBIZ reports several dozen times, maybe as many as 50. I'm aware of some of the updates they've made. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm aware that they have added a feature that you can now input tower density, so you can create these estimated ranges, if you will. And I'm very familiar with the basic settings that you have certain controls you can do, like time zone. What time zone am I going to have it? Am I going to use the coverage density? Am I going to save my work? Am I going to just exit the program? I physically have seen those features a number of times.
As it relates to this particular case, have you had a chance to look at any exhibits prepared by Detective Mallory using the KOHBERGER program?
Yes, but I should clarify. One of them I'm pretty familiar with. I believe it's State Exhibit 48 that was used for the grand jury. The others I had never seen until I believe it was last week. So I'm probably gonna have to look at those if you're gonna ask me questions on those. But State's 48, I'm pretty.
I want to ask you a question about that. I'll ask you some other questions about the records we received last week. I'm going to have you handed what was admitted last week as states are, just another, my copy of it so that you know what we're talking about here.
Okay.
I'm curious about what was needed to go into CASBIZ to create that.
So when I open the CASBIZ program, I have to input what I'm going to refer to as source data. So let me define source data is any data that is an electronic format, typically a text file, that the CASBIZ program is going to link to this mapping session and use that source data to create the images we're seeing. I can tell you right off the bat, without a doubt, this one is linked to two different source data. One is going to be a set of CDR records, so the regular AT&T CDRs. And then this particular exhibit would require the regional AT&T tower list, which is a text file that contains all of the cell site locations, most likely be Western Washington, Idaho, and Eastern Washington, Idaho, and Western Montana is typically that region. But there's no way this map was created without the AT&T tower list. It's physically impossible.
Is the AT&T tower list, was that contained in the call detail records that were obtained by search warrants relating to Mr. KOHBERGER?
It was not.
All right. And in the CASBIZ program, when you input the CDR call detail records and you input the tower list, does that program create any type of log?
It does, and I want to make the record really clear on what I'm testifying to, because it can get kind of confusing when we start talking about different versions. The CASBIZ program offers two styles of mapping. I can just default to a normal size, what they're going to refer to as a wedge shape, which is representing the sector the device connected to. If I was doing that, all I need is the AT&T records, because the AT&T CDRs actually have the tower information that's required for that mapping. As soon as I change that feature, though, to add coverage areas, the estimated coverage areas, and now these little wedge shapes or these sectors are all different sizes, the CAS program has to be linked to a tower list that has location of all of those towers. That's the only way the program knows how to size the cell sites. So I just want to clarify, if I'm mapping the CDRs without coverage areas, all I need is the CDRs. If I'm mapping the coverage areas in the CASBIZ program, I have to have a tower list. This one, I can see three different sectors. Two of them, if anybody sees this exhibit, just to make the record really clear, they're really hard to see. One of them is just under the N as in Nora, under the word Pullman. The other one is right by the L in Pullman. But they're different sizes. And that tells me right off the bat that the AT&T tower list was used.
And why are they different sizes? Mind again, please.
Cell tower density, we see a great big sector right in the middle of this map, and I'm not familiar with the area here. It's basically south of Pullman and south of Moscow, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Not a lot of cell towers out there, so one tower covers a very large area. Then the other two are going to be in Pullman. It's kind of hard to see on this map, but I believe they are going to be ones that are on Washington State University campus. a lot more cell towers, the coverage is much smaller. So it's just a way to look at tower density to kind of estimate how far certain towers may connect to a phone where others may have a very short range.
And is it based on that difference in towers that causes you to know that a certain type of tower report was used?
Yeah, it is a basic algorithm that uses tower density, and the only way to determine tower density is to have a list that has all of the towers, not just the ones that were used by the cell phone.
Okay. Do we have the list of the tower list that was used by Detective Mallory in developing that exhibit?
Detective Mallory stated he did not use a tower list to create this exhibit, so no, but I'm not sure how to answer that other than I haven't seen one.
Should it be there?
It is physically impossible to create this map without it.
If you had the logs from the CASBIZ program, would that give you more information about what was used?
It would. We would need the CASBIZ program as well. The logs are saving certain settings, and it's a JSON format, which is just a software language. We could load that JSON file into the CASBIZ program, and for the most part, we could replicate exactly what was done.
If I understand that, to turn it around, in order to replicate that and to see what was done, you would need a CASBIZ program. Is that right?
Correct, and preferably the same version that was used.
And you need a JSON file that was made by Detective Mallory. Is that right?
Correct, and depending on where this software program is, we would probably need the source data again because it may not be automatically linked. Anybody who did PowerPoint 10 years ago, you make a PowerPoint on one computer, you save it on a thumb drive, you go to a different computer, all the links are broken. It could create a situation like that. So you would probably need the original source data as well, just to be sure.
What's the original source data?
In this case, it would be the AT&T CDRs and the cell tower, the regional cell tower list.
From that time?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, no, if we're trying to recreate this work, this is where it gets a little bit complex. We would need the exact AT&T tower list that Mallory used but didn't use, which makes it really difficult because AT&T updates these on a fairly regular basis. If he used a November list and I use an April list, the results could be different.
Why would the results be different and given the month of the video?
AT&T could have added or subtracted cell sites in the area, which would change the tower density. They could also reconfigure those cell sites, so maybe they point different directions. Given the rural area, 2 or 3 months, I don't think you're going to see much of a change, but it's always possible. So if we're talking about recreating this exhibit exactly the way it was, we would need not just the regional tower list, we would need to know which version of the regional tower list to use.
Is that generally why people in your field save their work?
We're talking best practices 101. We're creating a work product that is going to be used in a forensic nature, not showing how an extraction is done, not showing the source data that I use to create an exhibit. It happens, but for the most part, it's unheard of, especially somebody who is a subject matter expert in digital forensics. I won't say I haven't seen it, but it is rare.
Thank you. Let's move on and talk about the cast draft. Have you?
I'm sorry, Ms. Taylor, the passport report.
Draft? Have you?
Can I ask how much longer on this? Because we're 90 minutes. I need to give the court order break. But if you're gonna finish, in 5 or 10 minutes, that's probably fine.
Your Honor, I would say we probably have 15 or 20 minutes or so. If the court wants to do a break, we can, or
Yeah, let's take a recess. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Relax.
Yeah, sorry.
Good? Not on the record yet. We're not on the record. Oh, Okay, we are back on record. This is State versus KOHBERGER. CR 2922-2805. Everybody I identified previously are still here in the courtroom. Mr. Sy Ray is testifying. We are still on direct. Ms. Taylor, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Ray, when we left off at our break, I was about to talk to you about the CAS draft report.
Okay.
So we'll start there. Have you reviewed a CAS draft report in Mr. KOHBERGER's case?
I have.
And from your review of that report, can you tell what records were relied on by Agent Balance to create that report?
That report would include, he had to have the AT&T CDRs, the full 6 months. A tower list to make some conversions that I'm seeing on the report. And also drive test data, which would be another form of source data. And then a mapping platform to ingest the drive test data into to analyze it to create these shapes that are then put into the draft report.
Okay, I think I have that. Do we have the same call detail records that Nick Balance used to create his draft report?
Yes, well, I believe so.
Do those records appear to come from the December 23rd, 2022 to AT&T warrants?
I would say primarily the second warrant from what I've reviewed.
And is that because the CAST draft report spans the full 6 months of those records?
That is correct.
Okay, and those records, did those come from the second AT&T search warrant?
That is also correct.
Can you tell anything about the tower report or how the tower information was used by Agent Nick Balance?
The tower identifiers that are predominantly used, not exclusively, but predominantly used in the CAS draft report did not come from the report AU. If there's a conversion that can be made and someone would have to have the national AT&T tower list, or at least the regional list. And I would take information from the CDRs. I would look at certain columns in this AT&T tower list, and I could get certain identifiers that are now being populated to the CAS report, if that makes sense.
Do we have a copy of the tower list that you believe was used?
We recently received 4 different versions. And when I say versions, they're just by month. And I believe we have August, September, November, and maybe December, or maybe it's in October. I'd have to go back and look. So far, I've only had time to look at the November. And from what I can tell, all of that appears to be accurate.
Would we need the October or the missing month to be able to do our work accurately?
It's a really good practice. I'm sure that's why the FBI included it. If I'm mapping records over a long period of time, like in this case, 6 months, I do want to see the different versions of the tower list to make sure that if a change was made within the network during that 6-month period, a tower I map in July may map differently in November. So it is important to have that data.
We have 4 of the 6 months, but not the other 2.
Correct. It would be helpful to even maybe see May, because there may not have been an update made in late June, early July. So May's would be what I would start with.
Can you tell if drive testing was done to create that CAST draft?
Yes, there's images in the latter part of the report up around slides 100 and above. I believe there's a total of 4 images that were populated to that report that would require drive testing.
When somebody's doing drive testing, do you expect data to be produced?
Absolutely. Creating a work product that uses drive testing and then coming into court and testifying without the drive testing is no different than creating an exhibit like this and then saying, well, we don't have to produce the AT&T records that created this. The source data for drive testing is the drive test.
Do we have the drive testing that was done by the FBI to help create that report?
We have what I believe is the majority. There are some significant pieces missing. I can't say that those missing pieces exist and haven't been turned over, or they were erroneously not collected. I don't know which, but there are some pretty significant pieces that are missing.
I'm gonna ask you some questions about that, but first I wanna know when you first saw drive testing data that was produced to us in Discovery, what did that cover?
I found a file in the discovery, I want to say early December, that included drive test, but it was about a 3-minute sample that covered less than a quarter of a mile in a completely irrelevant location. So it added no value to my analysis at all.
What were you looking for? What time frame and location were you looking for based on the CAS draft report review?
I would expect significant drive testing around any location that coverage maps were being used in the CAS report. I would expect significant documentation on potential routes that this device may have taken. I would expect significant documentation on the crime scene.
You just told us that you think we have most of it, but there's some significant parts that are missing.
Yeah, and I want to qualify that just so it's really clear, because I understand it's starting to get very technical. There's over 500,000 lines of data that was turned over. So I'll make it clear, there's a lot of data that has been produced. I would say, in my opinion, looking at what's been produced, probably 2 or 3% is missing, but it's not the amount of data or the time of the data, it's the locations of the data. Some of the most significant locations in this case we're missing some data.
Those significant locations, have they been depicted or captured on the CAS draft report?
They have.
And tell me what those locations are. What are we missing?
I am unable to find any measurements along, I believe it's 270, the Moscow-Pullman Road. If you drove the most direct route from Pullman to Moscow or vice versa, pretty much as soon as you're leaving Pullman to the time that you arrive in Moscow, we are missing that entire stretch. And if there's ever been a case that we need to look at, what does it look like when a phone travels from Pullman to Moscow? This is probably the case. We have the neighborhood around the crime scene, but we don't have the crime scene. Normally, that wouldn't be too terribly significant, because if it's a flat area, there's not a lot of vegetation or mountains. You could probably interpret the same. The location of this crime scene is very unique because it sits on a mountain. Part of it is shielded by a mountain. There's a lot of other big, thick, dense apartment buildings there. Your phone is going to behave differently inside of that residence than it might on the road behind the residence or in front of the residence. I can't find any drive test data that actually encapsulates any part of the property.
You talked about the device that helps do the drive testing or that captures the data while you're doing the drive testing. What's that called again?
It's a drive test scanner. The most common one used in law enforcement is created by Road and Schwartz, that same company I referred to earlier. I'm familiar with the hardware that the FBI uses, and it is a Road and Schwartz scanner.
Is it called Gladiator?
Gladiator is the company that sells the product to the FBI. Gladiator actually buys this product from Road and Schwartz, and it does what they call white labeling. So they buy the hardware from Road Schwartz and they kind of slap their sticker on it and they put their software in it, and then they sell it to the FBI. But ultimately, it is a Road and Schwartz piece of hardware.
And once you have that piece of hardware, once you have this device, does it just work forever, or is there anything that has to be done to make sure it's working properly?
It is a technical piece of equipment that takes measurements. It is required to be calibrated. The best way that for probably everybody in the courtroom to think of, if we go a little old school, is the old breath test. If you had a DUI and law enforcement couldn't produce the calibration records of the breath test, it was really problematic. Similar thing here. We want to see that the device is calibrated. In this case, it's really important because keep in mind, I reviewed thousands of these drive tests over my career. There is a significant gap that I believe there's something malfunctioning in the equipment, or the operators are just not paying attention. I can't tell you which one it is. So in this case, the calibration records to show that that device is functioning properly are really critical.
Do we have those calibration records on the device that was there more than one device used?
There's actually 2 devices used.
And was this drive test done on just one day? Is this a one-time shot?
No, I think there's maybe 5 days total that I've seen drive test data collected.
Okay. So now let's talk about the calibration for this instrument or this machine. Did we get records for all the machines that were used by the FBI in this case?
We got the calibration records that were taken prior to the use of these, of the samples. It'd be really helpful to have the calibration records after the use. So we kind of need to bookend those because we know that it left Rochewar's factory in October and everything was working great. When it came back, we don't know when it came back, and we don't know if it was functioning properly when it came back. It's not uncommon for there to be errors. If I saw a report and said it came in and it had 2 errors, it's not the end of the world. The sky doesn't fall. You have to get into the documentation to see what those errors were. Normally, the device kind of self-calibrates itself. If you know what you're looking at, the major concerns that you would see when calibration is off, it becomes very obvious because results are really flawed. That's where I have a concern in this case is we have what I consider a significant chunk of data for specifically a location where the instrument is running. There's no doubt it's functioning, but it's not properly collecting AT&T data, which is concerning as to why.
Because there were multiple drive tests done, and you talk about bookending these calibration reports, would you need to bookend all of the time that the drive testing was done with these calibration reports? And what I'm saying is if there's something done in November and then drive testing done in December and then more drive testing done in January and then maybe some in March, do you need the bookend calibration reports around each of those drive tests?
You would. To date, I haven't seen any drive test data, I believe, beyond January 5th. And I'm not sure the time zone, so maybe it could creep into January 6th. But if there's any drive test data after the first week of January, I'm unaware of it.
Okay. So in our case, which months are we missing?
For the calibration,
Yes.
whatever the next calibration, the FBI would choose when to send these devices in. So whenever that next calibration report was generated for these 2 devices.
On the calibration certificates we have, I think you told us that after the maintenance, it went back into service and passed inspection, was functioning properly.
But when it came in, it didn't have multiple errors, but when it went out, it was functioning properly.
Is that why you need to see the next one on the other side of the drive testing?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, when we're thinking about the data the drive test data that we have that's missing some significant portions, could it be because the machine wasn't working right all the time they tried to do drive testing?
Yes.
Okay. Is it also possible that the FBI agents using this machine weren't properly trained to do the drive test data or to do the drive testing and collect data?
I know of the 2 FBI agents from prior lives. I believe they're properly trained.
So we're looking at either the machine itself isn't functioning properly, or could that data have been pulled out of what we got?
If we're talking about possible scenarios that would cause the shortcoming of data, maybe it was never captured in the first place. I can't speak to that. The machine erroring, at least during one portion of this drive test, I've seen similar errors before. I'm pretty sure they had a small period of time where it had been a very busy day and it kind of gave up for a little while, like any computer will, and it needed to be reset. Could things be extracted and us not know It's always possible. I can't rule that out.
Is the missing data important to you to fulfill your duties in Mr. Kohberger's case?
I don't recall when I got involved in this case on the day where I could actually start looking at evidence. I've had a concern since the very first day I saw the cast draft report that there are significant errors in the drive testing. It was before I even saw the drive testing. I can look at the coverage areas and I can tell you they're wrong. So yes, it's not a concern that they're wrong. People make mistakes. We can fix things. It's a concern that I still don't have the source data that any expert, not just myself, but anybody could sit down and look at and say, okay, I see what's happening here. Here's how we fix this. Unfortunately, that mistake has a ripple effect, and I'm seeing multiple errors that are happening as a result. So that's why this data is important, is we've reached a point that we need to determine, is this just human error? Is this accidental? Is it intentional? Is there other things at play here that's changing this narrative to where there's clearly some manipulation of the original data?
And having that data, will that help us answer that question?
It's the only way we're going to answer that question.
All right, I have just a couple of other questions for you, and I'm going to depart the cast report and the drive test data a little bit. Except, as an investigator or as a person doing an analysis of this case, did the drive test data tell you where a phone traveled to indicate other investigation that you should do?
Technically, the call detail records tell us that. The drive test data help us become more accurate with that. AT&T is one of the best companies in this particular situation to show device movement because we get a constant connection. So when, and I will emphasize, when all of the data is mapped, and I'm talking about the CDRs, we can get a really good idea. Hey, a phone traveled north for 10 miles and then it traveled east. The drive test data would actually allow us to replicate and recreate these tower handoffs that we're seeing to come up with that first theory to now we can say, in order to do this and hit these towers in the sequence that it did, it has to be driving on this highway. And then when it went east, it most likely turned onto this highway. So the drive test data helps us get very specific with what the CDRs mean.
As an investigator in performing an analysis work done in this case, when you have the CDRs, the call detail records that tell you where a phone's been, is that useful in directing your investigation to what other evidence might be out there, like videotapes?
Qualify my answer because I'm not sure if you're asking specifically for this case or in general. Yes, you map all of the data. And especially if you're going to justify 6 months worth of data on somebody's cell phone, you map every single connection that there is in those records. From what I have reviewed, the FBI mapped 6% of the data that came in. Mallory's testimony and what I've seen through here, he was up to about 18%. So by either standard, more than 80% on both accounts were never mapped or accounted for. And I'm not talking overall from every single day for 6 months. I'm talking about the timeframes that are chosen. So for example, this time period that's represented here is where I'm getting the 18%.
And that's the 48 hours.
This is specifically from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on the morning of the 13th, arguably the most critical time period of this entire investigation. They mapped a handful of connections. When I say handful, they mapped 18%. When you add the other 82%, it tells a much more detailed story. When we put the drive test data on top of that, you can get even more refined. But to answer your question on any case, that's this case, on any case, and we teach best practices. We've established best practices going back to 2008 in law enforcement of what you do with this type of data. It is a terrible practice to justify probable cause for this very detailed call detail records that give breadcrumb-like trails for individuals and then not map it. We justify an entire probable cause statement saying we have to have this. not mapping it and then making decisions and work products with leaving that out is extremely problematic.
Last week, we received some additional records that Detective Mowry found when he was preparing for his testimony on this mission to compel. Have you had a chance to review those records?
I have. A couple of them are very technical, so I'm not going to say that I've mastered them yet, but I have a good idea of what was provided and what it means.
Based on your, I guess, not as thorough as you'll do review of these records, do you have a sense as to whether these records matter to us and what we're doing to defend Mr. KOHBERGER?
Given the timing of these records, from what I can tell in the emails that were produced by Detective Mowry, these records were generated on the 23rd of December. It's when everything started with probable cause statements. If I had to pick a time when the wheels fell off the wagon, that's the date. There are statements and there's assumptions made in the records that will never be supported by the data. There's a lot of claims that are said in these emails, and even the name files of the records are problematic. It does not represent what it's claimed to represent.
Sounds like those might be pretty important to us defending Mr. KOHBERGER.
I could give examples, but I know it's a very technical thing, so I'm not, it could be extremely impactful to either side. I'm not saying just in defending Mr. KOHBERGER, it could be extremely impactful in prosecuting Mr. KOHBERGER. The problem's the problem, not what the data helps or hurts.
The content of the data, though, is it helpful to us in representing Mr. KOHBERGER?
It absolutely is helpful. Everything that I've seen to date is concerning to me because it's exculpatory. And I need to clarify this. When all of the records are produced and the dust settles and I have time to review it, I reserve the right to say, no, now I'm seeing everything. Here's what I'm seeing. Because of the piecemealing of the data, because of the missing data, because of data that I'm reviewing that is incredibly inaccurate, everything that is missing is absolutely in the benefit of the defense right now. There's other reports that I believe are missing that I can't tell you are in the benefit of Mr. KOHBERGER or in the benefit of the state. If I was contacted on December 1st by Moscow Police Department, there are things I would have absolutely said, you get this today, do not hesitate, and especially come December 23rd. Not because of who it's helpful for, but because those documents are the only things we're going to get that's going to be able to allow us to interpret what it really means. When we don't get those documents and we piecemeal things, it creates this narrative that is very harmful for the defense's case. As I've got more documents, I'm finding it's not harmful for the defense's case. There's a lot of misstatements that have been made. So yes, to your question, to date, it is very helpful for Mr. KOHBERGER. I reserve the right to change that opinion in 6 months, depending on what type of documents are released and what's out there.
Fair enough. I need just a minute, but I don't think I have any other questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Ray, thank you. I don't have any other questions right now, but hold on. The prosecutor might.
All right. Ms. Taylor, Ms. Jennings.
No, I don't have any questions at this time.
All right, okay, it's the excuse.
He may, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Ray, you're free to stay, you're free to leave if you like. Sure. Thank you. Another witness?
Your Honor, we do not have any other witnesses. We have argument for the court.
Okay. Let's go ahead then.
Your Honor, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with Ms. NASA. She's going to cover one of the requests specific to the grand jury subpoenas, and then I'll cover the rest of this morning's argument.
Okay, thank you.
Your Honor, to facilitate this argument on this point, I am going to hand you defense exhibits A and B that were submitted in our records for today. I want you to be able to look at them while I'm talking.
Thank you.
As of today, there have been at least 50 federal grand jury subpoenas that have been issued in this case. Exhibits A and Exhibits B are an example of copies of grand jury subpoenas that we have received out of those more than 50. And what I didn't provide to you that goes behind that what we got with those is the subpoenas include attachment A, which explains what is being subpoenaed. And then what has been produced is the responses to those subpoenas. And in some of the subpoenas, we also have the certification by the person who has produced the records in response to the subpoena. Some of them are missing. We have asked the state to produce all of the subpoenas. And their response is that they are not in possession and control of those subpoenas, and they do not intend to use the subpoenas as an exhibit. And we have not justified why we need those subpoenas. And for those reasons, they are not going to produce them. I'd like to begin by saying that as it relates to any argument that the state is not in possession and control, rather than beat the dead horse on that issue, Idaho Supreme Court came down in 2023 and made it crystal clear that anybody that's acting on behalf of as an agent of the state puts those records in the hands of the state, and they need to produce them. State versus Pendleton, 2003. The other thing is that in terms of the state arguing that they are not going to use a subpoena as an exhibit, that is not in and of itself a defense to not produce a document to us. We have a million reasons why we need to look at documents. We understand that out of the 51 terabytes that have been produced, that not all of that is evidence that's going to be coming before the court or the jury, but it doesn't mean that they aren't material or exculpatory. The subpoenas, based on reviewing the records, are in the hands of basically three agents. There is an FBI forensic agent by the name of forensic accountant, Michael Douglas. There's a special agent, Travis Shirley, and there is another agent, Mary Tyndall. These are the three agents that are receiving the subpoenas, reaching out to the providers that they're serving and asking for the documents. For the court to understand why we need these documents, I want to tell you what we're doing with discovery and timelines. There are more than 100 search warrants in this case. There are more than 50 grand jury subpoenas in this case. You've heard all kinds of information about the probable cause affidavit and the timing of that. Timing in this case for the defense is everything. So we are creating timelines that put in the dates of affidavits of warrants, the information that's received, and the date that it's produced. With subpoenas, when we don't get a copy of the subpoena and all we get is the warrant or is the subpoena return, we don't know the scope of what the state has asked for. We don't know the date that the subpoena was served. And in some of them, we don't know that there is a certified return. So we can't take our timeline on warrants and our timeline on the probable cause affidavit and our timeline on everything else that we're putting in there and interlay the subpoena information that the state is getting. And we are desperate to find out the timeline in this case and when the state knew what and when. There's no question that motions to suppress are coming. Motions to suppress are coming on warrants. And whether or not those motions to suppress are based on Frank's material because misrepresentations are made, depends on the timeline. So if there's a representation made in a warrant that things happened in a certain way, if we are able to look at the timeline and say, we know that the state knew this when, that gives us an answer on whether or not the suppression issue includes a truthful statement in the affidavit. And if I'm not making sense, I want you to tell me to clarify that. But we need to know the timeline of all of the evidence in this case and when the state knew what it knew, or why certain things were being looked at before Mr. KOHBERGER's arrest or well into late in the year in 2023 related to the victims, and try to piece together, is that something that the state is still seeking because they're pursuing the alternate suspects that exists in this case? There's so many things that we're trying to understand. So what we're asking you to do is enter an order compelling them to produce the subpoenas. You see that they had at least 2 in their possession that they possess, and it will clarify it for us. And we will be able to create our timeline and put all of these things together and know when and why the state was doing these things. And just to add one other component, you know, you're hearing about cell phone records and cell phone records today being produced on warrants. Well, there were several sets of cell phone records that were produced pursuant to a grand jury subpoena. Still not clear to us why warrant versus subpoena, and they're different providers. And some of it's for phone numbers that we have to figure out who those phone numbers are. But all of this information is critical and material for us to be able to do the case, to do our work in this case. So I would ask that you enter an order to compel, and that way the state has the ability to take that to the FBI agents and say, the court has entered an order, we've got to produce the subpoenas, and we'll get the subpoenas. And to the extent that the state may stand up and say, you know, we've got this 2E demands, we've got to deal with 2E. I just want to make it really clear for the court that 2E is not an obstacle. 2E is a hoop to jump through. The code related to 28 CFR 16.21 specifically states that the purpose of 2E is not to prevent federal agents from giving states discovery in a criminal case. Purpose of 2E is because these federal departments want to know when certain records are leaving their files. Understandable, but it's not meant to keep us from getting records that we need in this case.
Thank you.